In fact, the Voortrekkers had trespassed across the border of a mighty African kingdom, inhabited by people very different from the Khoisan of the Cape. They had encountered the Zulus.
When they ran into the Zulus, they ran into a group of people who were very different to anybody else they'd been up against up until that point in time. This was an organized group of people.
The Zulus were the authors of a unique and highly developed African state. Their military skills had allowed them to overwhelm their native African neighbors. They held more than 30,000 square miles of land and had established a sophisticated economy and society. The ferocity of the Zulu defense of their land was something the Voortrekkers had simply not expected.
It was more than the Boers could handle. They were not prepared for the attack from the Zulus. They were up against a king who could mobilize an army of 10 to 15,000 men without any problem at all, that could take on almost anybody. They were absolutely fearless.
The Voortrekkers were stunned and devastated. Had they and the power of guns, germs, and steel met their match in Africa? The Voortrekkers showed little interest in who the Zulus were, or how they'd developed such a sophisticated state. They wanted a showdown. They gathered their scattered forces behind a great circle of wagons and readied themselves for battle. At dawn on the 16th of December, 1838, more than 10,000 Zulus stormed across the horizon, charging in to destroy the outnumbered settlers. But this time, the Europeans were able to use their technology to maximum effect. To increase the rate of fire from their muzzle-loading rifles, some would shoot while others would reload.
It was shoot, hand the gun over, take the next gun, fire, hand the gun over. So every 5 or 6 seconds you could fire a shot. See, that was the important thing.
This time, not a single Zulu could get within 10 paces of the encampment. It was a massacre.
The Voortrekkers had probably killed an estimated 3,000 to 3,500 Zulus. The Boers themselves suffered only 3 injuries.
The conflict became known as the Battle of Blood River. The Zulus had been broken. Guns, germs, and steel had prevailed.
The victorious European settlers pushed on beyond Zulu lands, while new developments in their technology let them increase the pace of conquest. Railroads were key. With railroads, one could transport lots of people and their supplies over vast areas. And so in Africa, Europeans started to build railroads, move into the interior and transport themselves and their supplies.
This was the era of the Industrial Revolution, a revolution that introduced one further weapon to the colonization of Africa. A weapon that put the same devastating firepower seen at Blood River into the hands of just a single man.
This is a Maxim gun. What made this weapon such a great weapon as opposed to the old single-shot weapons that had been used in years before was this gun could fire continuously for up to 500 rounds a minute. It had the equivalent firepower of probably 100 men in a company with single-shot weapons.
As they drove further into Africa, Europeans encountered new tribes, some just as hostile to invasion as the Zulus had been. But for peoples like the Matabele, there was simply no answer to the world's first fully automatic weapon. The Matabele conflict of October 1893 lasted a matter of hours.
The settlers mowed down those Matabele warriors until there were only a few of them left. It was a real case of ancient technology up against the latest and greatest as far as European inventions were concerned.
It seemed like the birth of a new age. Europeans carving a path into the interior of Africa, conquering tribe after tribe, settling where they pleased. Guns, germs, and steel triumphant. Except now, those settlers would find themselves facing an entirely new enemy. One that had once been their greatest ally: geography.
As they moved north, settlers cleared land for farms, confident they could build a prosperous life in Africa. But with little warning, things began to go awry. The land became impossible to plow.
Come on!
Their crops refused to grow.
Come on!
Their shoes fell apart in the mud.
Move! Come on!
And that was only the start.
Come on, man!
The second big problem that Europeans encountered was their animals died. Their horses and oxen had been a big part of the European advantage elsewhere in the world. Oxen as draft animals and horses as their military animals. But here the animals were dying.
For thousands of years, these domesticated animals and crops had sustained European civilization. Without them, there would have been no guns, germs, and steel. No history of conquest and colonization. And now, the settlers themselves began to fall ill with terrible fevers. While all around them, they could see native Africans farming, herding cattle, healthy and alive. How was this possible? What were the secrets of this strange new land?
The ideas behind guns, germs, and steel all spring from an understanding of geography. And geography explains why Europeans were now failing.
European crops had grown well in the Cape because the Cape was a mirror of the European world, lying on a similar latitude. But as the settlers progressed into the African interior, they'd been moving north, closer and closer to the equator. At about 23 degrees south, near the river Limpopo, they passed a major geographical boundary known as the Tropic of Capricorn. They were leaving behind their familiar European climate and entering a totally different world. They had entered the tropics. Compared to the European or temperate zones, the tropics operate by entirely different rules. Instead of the 4 seasons of Europe, North America, and the Cape, here there are just 2. The dry season and the rainy. Wheat and barley, the crops that had sustained European civilization for centuries, had not evolved to survive in this tropical climate. Yet the native Africans, the Zulus, the Matabele, all the tribes that the settlers had encountered, depended on agriculture just as much as the Europeans. How were they succeeding as the Europeans failed? Even today, the continent of Africa is composed of thousands of different tribal groupings. Each is subtly distinct from the next in custom and language.
Such diversity means that most Africans have to master more than one language, and they acquire those skills at a very young age. I would like to find out how many languages you speak. Who here knows how to speak Bemba? Aha! Does anybody else know how to understand or speak Lozi? You speak Lozi?
Yes.
Do you also speak Bemba?
Yes.
Is there another language that you speak also?
Slovak.
Slovak. That's 4 languages. That's good. Most Americans speak only one language. After a little exposure to these different languages, you begin to realize one thing. They all sound remarkably similar. I'm fascinated with languages, and wherever I've been going, I'm asking Africans, what's your language, and tell me some words in your language. So here's what I found out for the word for sun. In the Nyanja language, sun is Zuba. In the Bemba language, it's Akasuba. In Chiwa, it's Duzuba. And in the Senga language, it's Zuba again. Or the word for water. In the Nyanja language, it's Manzi. And in Bemba, it's Amenshi. And in Chiwa, it's Manzi, similar to each other again. What do these linguistic similarities tell us? That there is a common root for most of the modern languages of tropical Africa. A single ancestral language, spoken by a single group of people, from which the many languages of today have descended.
Linguistic analysis has isolated a family of languages known as Bantu, which originated in tropical West Africa. About 5,000 years ago, the early Bantu speakers began to spread into new lands, bringing their crops, their animals, and their language with them. And over centuries, Bantu culture evolved, diversifying into hundreds of tribes, expanding across the tropical region of Africa.